Yeah, I totally agree with you. And with things like change requests, it's one of the biggest things we see in organizations. If they're not capturing their SOW lifecycle in a system, which most people aren't effectively, in fact, most people are absolutely way off. Generally, there might be no information below a PO level, very scant information, which may well have kind of been written by the supplier in a kind of marking their own homework type of situation. But almost nobody has any visibility of change requests. Almost no companies do. And I feel confident in saying that because we speak to a lot of organizations. It's stuff that just, or procurement certainly don't. And where the people are capturing that in emails or they're writing it in a little, book, like I am for the notes of this podcast.
Right. Absolutely.
That is important information. It really is.
Yep.
And it's such a key area where suppliers could be pulling the wool over people's eyes potentially if they're going a bit rogue and taking advantage of the situation, or it could be really legitimate. But ultimately, you don't want to have to be arguing about it after the fact. It should be a proper part of the process. And like you were saying about sign off, in our system, for example, we see a lot of organizations that will have variable sign off based on the requirement for the initial requirement and the engagement with the supplier and the sign off of the SOW. But then when it comes to change requests, some people will go through the same level of sign off for every change request. And it's basically updating the statement of work, referring back to the MSA. But for some organizations, they'll say if a change request is like this, it can just go through the PM and it's kind of like a soft sign off. But if it looks like this, then it needs to have a more comprehensive sign off. But most people aren't capturing stuff around changes at all, and they find it particularly difficult. And that is where what I was saying about that report on services procurement technology, if you're buying goods and materials, this doesn't really come up. It's not the same process. So if you're buying goods and materials, what you're buying is simple, but the supply chain can be extremely complex. And that's how most source to pay and procure to pay systems are focused, because they came out of the evolution of the ERP. When you look at services procurement, what you're buying is extremely complicated, variable, can change during delivery. I'm just thinking like a agile IT project that's changing in iterations. So that is completely the opposite. But the supply chain is generally simple. So it's different requirements. But the technology landscape hasn't really caught up with how quickly the market has shifted. And it's, that article was saying 50% of spend on average in globally across organizations is services procurement. Obviously, that depends. If it's a manufacturing organization, it's going to be skewed towards goods and materials. If it's a bank, it's going to be like 98% services. But, it is important enough for people to have to worry about this.
No, it's true. Very true.
One of the other things I was going to come back to was you mentioned a little bit about scoping and which people you feel it's relevant to have involved with the scoping process. I just wanted to come back and kind of delve into that a bit more deeply, because it's such a critical part of it. And one of the things I was going to ask you was, where do you think the kind of origination should sit? Because there will be people collaborating, but where do you think origination should sit in terms of who is it who actually, gets the keyboard going on a Word document or puts pen to paper in, and the first, and that's what I was going to say. I think that's possibly the hardest bit.
It is.
Where does that origination's responsibility sit?
Well, it's kind of how I look at it is that the high level scope, like what are we trying to build? It's entirely with your customer, whoever the customer is. They need to be telling me, what do you need? What happens a lot is a vendor will do a demo of a nice nifty tool, and then the business will go, I want that, and that. And that's how they build it. And they end up losing sight of what their real objectives were. And then in the end, they're always disappointed because they're like, yeah, I didn't quite get what I wanted. Well, you saw that shiny new tool, and I know you guys have a shiny new tool, and I love your tool, by the way. But at the same time, is that it needs to start when you're envisioning what you're going to do. It needs to be tool agnostic, really having a clear picture of the problems you're trying to solve and how you wish to do that without knowing what the technology could do, it doesn't matter what it is you're trying to do. having an understanding of what the problem you're trying to solve and what that looks like, what your future looks like. That's what you're trying to do, is the problems, and then having an idea of what your future state looks like is really where that starts. And absolutely, depending on how you go about figuring out the details to that. I mean, you can have a business analyst sit down with you and talk through that and get a picture of it. I like to flow chart, like, okay, so your problem is this, and it's currently like this. How, what are you seeing in the future? How does this work in the future? And from that naturally flows what is your scope going to look like? And I like to have that high level, because it gets kind of lost in when you start, especially when you're doing like technical projects, is you get lost in the weeds of the technical, that you lose sight of what your actual objective was, or what the problem was that you were trying to solve.